the 54-year silence. On December 14, 1972, a man named Gene Cernan climbed the ladder of a machine called Challenger and left the surface of the moon. As he stood on the top rung, he looked down at the gray, powdery regolith and spoke a promise into his helmet microphone that we would return with peace and hope for all mankind. For 19,468 days, that promise sat in the vacuum of space unfulfilled. The footprints of 12 men remained crisp and undisturbed, protected by the lack of wind, while on Earth, the very infrastructure that put them there was dismantled, defunded, and eventually turned into museum exhibits. For over 5 decades, the moon was no longer a destination, it was a memory. But on April 1st, 2026, at 6:35 p.m. Eastern Time, the silence of the lunar frontier was shattered by a machine that represents the single most expensive and complex engineering effort in the history of the American space program. This is the story of Artemis II. But it is not the story you saw on the news. To the mainstream media, this was a 10-day loop around the moon, a feel-good milestone for a new generation of astronauts. But for the engineers at the Marshall Space Flight Center, the policy analysts at the RAND Corporation, and the workers at the Michoud Assembly Facility in New Orleans, this mission was a high-stakes gamble against physics, a desperate race against a rising superpower in the East, and a critical test of a hardware design that many feared was fundamentally flawed. America's Rocket Factory. The journey began in a place known as America's Rocket Factory. The Michoud Assembly Facility is a sprawling 829-acre complex in New Orleans East. It is a place where 3 generations of families have spent their lives welding the impossible. During the 1960s, they built the first stages of the Saturn V. During the 80s and 90s, they built the orange external tanks for the space shuttle. And for the last decade, they've been welding the core stage of the Space Launch System. For workers like Amanda Gert-Jagensen, building the SLS core stage isn't just a job. It is a continuation of a lineage. The rocket that carried the Artemis II crew was built by 1,500 people who spent years perfecting friction stir welding on aluminum lithium tanks that stand 212 feet tall. The beast and its price tag. The Space Launch System generates 8.8 million pounds of thrust at liftoff, 15% more than the Saturn V. It uses 4 RS-25 engines, upgraded versions of the Space Shuttle's main engines. But unlike the shuttle, the SLS is disposable. Every time those 4 engines ignite, NASA is burning $100 million of hardware that will end up at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. The NASA Office of Inspector General estimated the cost of a single SLS launch at $4.1 billion. To put that in perspective, the entire Apollo 11 mission cost approximately $350 million in 1969. We are spending more to go back than we did to go the first time, and the reasons are as much about political geography as they are about orbital mechanics. The crew and the mascot. When the SLS cleared the tower at Pad 39B, it carried 4 people. Commander Reed Wiseman, pilot Victor Glover, mission specialist Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen of the Canadian Space Agency. Victor Glover made history as the first black astronaut to travel beyond low Earth orbit. But inside the cabin, there was a 5th crew member who became a viral sensation. A small plush mascot named Rise, designed by an 8-year-old boy named Lucas Ye from Mountain View, California. Rise served as the mission's zero-gravity indicator. But tucked inside a small zipper on his bottom was a micro SD card containing the names of 5.6 million people who participated in the Send Your Name to Space campaign. For the millions of people watching from home, that plushie was their proxy. Wiseman carried his own quiet tribute on this mission. His late wife, Carol Taylor Wiseman, who passed away from cancer in 2020 at age 46, was honored by the crew, who named a lunar crater Carol after her, a gesture Wiseman described as an incredibly powerful tribute to her legacy. But while the public was focused on the mascot, the crew was focused on the proximity operations demonstration. 3 hours and 38 minutes into the mission, Orion separated from the ICPS. Victor Glover took the controls, maneuvering the 26-ton spacecraft within meters of the discarded rocket stage, looking for optical target assemblies and a docking target emblazoned with an American flag. Glover's voice crackled over the radio. "I can see the side docking target. That is a good-looking American flag. Overall, guys, this flies very nicely, very precise." Every domain expert watching knew if Glover couldn't fly Orion manually with this level of precision, the future of the program was dead. The farthest humans have ever traveled. Hi, real quick before we get back to the good stuff, if you've been enjoying cardboard comics, that's awesome. I'm a single creator who is running the channel. Every frame, every sound, every word on this channel comes from me and probably a lot of coffee. So if you want to support what's happening here and get some cool stuff in return, I just launched a Patreon, early access, behind the scenes, polls where you pick what I cover next, and much more. Links in the description. Even just checking it out means a lot. Okay, back to the story of Artemis II, the farthest humans have ever traveled. On the 6th day of the mission, April 6th, the crew reached a point 248,000 miles from Earth. They broke the record for the farthest distance a human being has ever traveled from our home planet, a record held by the crew of Apollo 13 since 1970. Koch, who already held the record for the longest single spaceflight by a woman, 328 days aboard the ISS, was now adding a second historic milestone to her name. As they looped around the far side of the moon, the crew witnessed a solar eclipse from a vantage point no human eyes had ever possessed. They saw the sun disappear behind the lunar surface, revealing the solar corona in its full ghostly glory against the absolute blackness of deep space. For the scientists back on Earth, this was a treasure trove of data. The crew recorded audible screams of delight from the lunar science team as they transmitted images of the lunar far side and the solar corona. They even witnessed micrometeorite impacts on the lunar surface, a rare sight that provided new insights into the violent environment of the lunar South Pole, the cracked shield. But the most dangerous part of the mission wasn't the flight around the moon. It was the return to Earth. When Orion hit the atmosphere on April 10th, it was traveling at 32 times the speed of sound, roughly 25,000 miles per hour. At those speeds, the air compresses so violently that it turns into plasma, a 5,000-degree Fahrenheit sheath of ionized gas that completely envelops the capsule. For 6 minutes, the 4 astronauts were in total radio blackout. As far as mission control was concerned, they were on another planet. The thermal protection system responsible for their survival was the Avcoat heat shield. After the uncrewed Artemis I mission in 2022, engineers had discovered a terrifying anomaly. The material had cracked and broken off in large fragments, a phenomenon called char liberation. NASA's independent review board spent 2 years understanding the physics. During the skip entry maneuver, gas was getting trapped inside the permeable char layer. The pressure would build during the skip phase and fracture the material. This was a classic normalization of deviance moment. Engineers eventually modified the re-entry trajectory for Artemis II to a lofted profile, reducing the gas buildup. When the 3 orange and white parachutes finally unfurled over the Pacific, it was a victory for the engineers who refused to accept good enough. The race for lunar ice. The success of Artemis II brings us to the uncomfortable implication that nobody in the mainstream is talking about. We are not just going back to the moon for science. We are in a race for real estate. The target for every major space power is the lunar South Pole. In the permanently shadowed craters, there are deposits of water ice that have sat undisturbed for billions of years. This water is the oil of the 21st century space economy. It can be broken down into hydrogen for rocket fuel and oxygen for breathing. Whoever controls the water ice controls the gateway to Mars and the rest of the solar system. The United States has established the Artemis Accords, signed by over 61 nations. But hidden in the text is a concept called safety zones. The accords state that nations can establish safety zones around their hardware and mining sites to prevent harmful interference. To critics in Russia and China, this looks like a loophole for de facto sovereignty, a way to claim territory on the moon without technically violating the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which forbids any nation from owning lunar land. China has responded by forming its own coalition, the International Lunar Research Station, which includes Russia and over 13 other nations. The 2029 deadline, the timeline for this race, is tightening. China has stated its goal is to land astronauts on the moon before 2030. But insiders at the RAND Corporation have pointed to a much more specific deadline. October 1st, 2029, the 80th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. A lunar landing on that date would be a symbolic victory of immense proportions. China's approach is a straightforward 2-launch architecture. One Long March 10 rocket carries the Lanyue lander. Another carries the Mengzhou crew vehicle. They meet in lunar orbit, land, and come home. No orbital gas stations, no tanker trains, no distributed contractor risk. Analysts describe it as on schedule and highly realistic. This brings us to the single greatest technical risk in the American plan, the SpaceX Starship. For Artemis III to land on the moon, SpaceX must launch a depot into Earth orbit and then launch as many as 14 tanker starships to refuel it, one every 6 days for months on end. If a single tanker fails or if the cryogenic fuel boils off too quickly, the entire mission is grounded. The NASA OIG has expressed significant concerns about this architecture noting it introduces hundreds of points of failure that the Apollo missions never faced. The restoration. As we look at the footage of the Artemis II crew emerging from their capsule on the deck of the USS Merthyr, the mission was a triumph. The 4 astronauts of Artemis II are now part of a legacy that includes the pioneers of Apollo. But their mission was different. Apollo was about proving we could go. Artemis is about proving we can stay. The great silence is over. The great race has begun. And the next footprint is just a few years away.